What if I told you that Hollywood's so-called tough guy image wasn't always an act? Some men stepped on set already carrying the scars of coal dust, prison yards, or battlefield fire. Their stare wasn't rehearsed, it was earned. Tonight we're counting down the 10 toughest actors in Hollywood history, and by the end you may never watch an old movie the same way again. These aren't just screen legends, they were survivors. Some bled for their craft, others dragged the weight of war across a studio floor, and a few brought the cold silence of real violence into the camera's eye. By the way, which Golden Age star would you least want to face in a back alley fight? Think carefully, your answer might change before we're done. Let's start with a man who practically laughed at Hollywood's attempt to tame him. Robert Mitchum, number 10 on our list, was never the polished studio gentleman. He was the chain gang runaway, the Depression-era drifter, the young boxer who fought under fake names just to eat. By 16, he had already served time in a Georgia prison camp, an experience brutal enough to etch a permanent stillness into his face. That sleepy-eyed glare wasn't a studio trick. It was a warning, the look of a man who had already tested the world and found it merciless. Mitchum's life before stardom reads like the kind of pulp fiction Hollywood loved to sell, but his was no script. He hopped freight trains, dug ditches, mined coal, and carried scars that makeup artists didn't need to paint on. When the cameras finally found him, they discovered someone who didn't have to pretend. Co-stars admitted he was unsettling to work with, not because he raged or postured, but because he carried himself like a man who had been in real fights and didn't need to prove it again. Director Edward Dmytryk once confessed that you didn't direct Robert Mitchum, you just rolled the film and prayed he didn't knock someone out between takes. And then came the scandal. In 1948, when police busted Mitchum for marijuana, the studio panicked. Conventional wisdom said his career was finished. Any other actor might have begged for forgiveness or issued a carefully written apology. Mitchum, he shrugged, did his 60 days in jail and walked out more popular than ever. The audience, oddly enough, admired his refusal to grovel. To them, he was the real article, an outlaw who didn't bend even under Hollywood's spotlight. Asked about his craft, Mitchum famously deadpanned, "I have two styles, with and without a horse." The line wasn't arrogance. It was the weary honesty of a man who knew acting couldn't compare to what life had already forced him to survive. And that's the unsettling secret. Robert Mitchum didn't fake toughness. He was toughness wrapped in a casual calm that made the studio system nervous, but made audiences lean in closer. So if you think number 10 already feels indestructible, just wait, because the next name on this list grew up swinging picks in a coal mine before taking his fight to the skies over Japan. Number 9, Charles Bronson. If Robert Mitchum carried the calm stare of a drifter, Bronson carried the weight of coal dust and war smoke. His silence on screen wasn't just a character choice, it was a survival reflex learned long before cameras ever rolled. Born as the 11th of 15 children in a dirt-poor Pennsylvania mining family, Bronson's earliest playground was hundreds of feet underground. At age 10, while other kids might have been kicking a ball, he was hauling coal, his small body coated in soot and exhaustion. That black dust didn't just settle on his skin, it carved into his soul. By the time he reached adulthood, silence had become his armor. He spoke little, but every movement suggested efficiency, like a man who didn't waste oxygen in the mines, and later didn't waste words in life. When World War II broke out, Bronson traded the mines for another deadly environment, the skies above Japan. As a B-29 tail gunner, he faced fire so intense, it rattled his bones. He earned a Purple Heart for wounds that might have killed another man, then returned home with no illusions about heroism. To Bronson, war wasn't glory, it was just another job that had to be done. That mindset would later define his Hollywood persona. On set, directors quickly realized they weren't working with a pretender. When Bronson threw a punch on camera, it landed with the precision of someone who'd actually learned where to strike in a real fight. Actor Jan Michael Vincent, who worked with him on The Mechanic, once admitted that when Bronson grabbed his shirt during a scene, he was stunned by the man's raw strength. He wasn't pretending, Vincent said. He could break you if he wanted to. The legend only deepened with Death Wish. After the film's release, real-life threats allegedly came from organized crime groups angered by the vigilante themes. The studio panicked, offering bodyguards. Bronson laughed it off. He simply muttered that he'd lived too long and seen too much to be scared of men sending letters. That quiet defiance, that refusal to bend, was exactly what audiences felt radiating from the screen. And yet Bronson never cared for fame. Unlike many stars who lived for applause, he only cared for the paycheck. He showed up, delivered his lines like steel, and left. No games, no publicity stunts, no ego. Just presence, the presence of a man forged by hunger, soot, and shrapnel. If Robert Mitchum was Hollywood's outlaw, then Charles Bronson was Hollywood's coal miner turned warrior, an embodiment of working-class toughness that needed no spotlight to validate it. And if you think mining at age 10 and bombing runs over Japan made him unbreakable, wait until you hear about the cowboy who filmed through broken ribs, missing organs, and even nuclear fallout. Number 8. John Wayne. If Charles Bronson carried coal dust in his lungs, Wayne carried radiation in his bones. To most of the world, he was the cowboy colossus, the swaggering duke, whose slow drawl and square shoulders defined American masculinity. But behind the hat and the horse was a man who kept working through broken ribs, missing organs, and a slow death sentence delivered by nuclear fallout. Wayne wasn't born into Hollywood privilege. He was the son of a struggling pharmacist raised in the rough grip of early 20th century rural America. To even get through college, he relied on grit more than talent, earning a football scholarship at USC. Not because he was polished, but because he was relentless. Before stardom, he hauled props, shifted scenery, and did the kind of back-breaking labor that most aspiring actors thought beneath them. For Wayne, work was survival, plain and simple. That same survival instinct defined his career. During the filming of The Alamo, Wayne cracked several ribs performing a horse stunt. Production slowed for no one, least of all him. He wrapped his torso, swallowed painkillers, and marched back onto set. Not a complaint, not a pause. He refused to let the cameras know he was hurt, because in his mind admitting pain meant weakness, and weakness was a luxury the Duke never allowed himself. The most chilling chapter came in 1956 when Wayne starred in The Conqueror shot near a nuclear test site in Utah. At the time, no one paid much attention to fallout warnings. Cast and crew wrestled with sandstorms that in truth carried radioactive particles. Out of 220 people involved in the production, nearly half would later develop cancer. Wayne himself would lose a lung and several ribs, undergoing a surgery that would have ended most careers. But months later, he was back in front of the camera performing stunts as if nothing had happened. It was more than stubbornness. It was his identity. Director Henry Hathaway once offered Wayne a stunt double after his surgery. Wayne glared at him and said flatly, "Either I do my own stunts, or you get someone else." That wasn't movie dialogue, it was an ultimatum. Even those who despised his politics couldn't deny his toughness. Kirk Douglas, his ideological rival, once admitted, "Disagree with his views all you want, but don't question the man's grit. I've seen him work through things that would send most men straight to the hospital." And here's the irony. Wayne built an empire playing indestructible cowboys, yet the very system that made him a legend likely poisoned him. Hollywood gave him the role of the American hero while quietly ensuring his real death sentence. He never stopped filming, never let audiences see him falter. That kind of toughness wasn't glamorous, it was tragic, a man chained to his own myth until the end. If you thought radiation couldn't silence a cowboy, wait until you meet a 5'5" brawler who blended the fists of a street fighter with the precision of a dancer. Number 7. James Cagney. If John Wayne was the towering cowboy who endured radiation and broken bones, Cagney was the wiry street fighter who turned dance steps into weapons. Standing only 5'5", he looked more like the neighborhood scrapper than a studio heavyweight, but that compact frame concealed a coil of explosive energy. He didn't have to roar to command a room. He simply moved, and when he moved, people got out of the way. Cagney grew up on Manhattan's Lower East Side, a place where children learned to fight long before they learned to read. Poverty and violence were his constant tutors. Bigger kids came at him daily, and survival meant hitting back harder, faster, and smarter. Boxing wasn't a hobby, it was self-defense in its rawest form. Those early brawls carved instincts into his muscles that no acting coach could ever replicate. By the time he hit Hollywood, he didn't need choreography to look convincing. He carried real reflexes honed in alleys and tenement hallways. Directors saw it instantly. His punches weren't the wide theatrical swings of stage fighting. They were sharp, precise, and devastatingly efficient. Raoul Walsh, who directed him, confessed that Jimmy knew how to throw a punch better than any actor he had ever worked with because he'd thrown plenty in real life. That credibility was electrifying on screen. Audiences leaned in, sensing something authentic. But Cagney had a secret weapon no street thug possessed dance. Before Hollywood typecast him as the gangster, he trained seriously in professional dance. That duality, a fighter's aggression combined with a dancer's precision, made him lethal both on and off camera. He could choreograph violence with timing that was musical, yet strike with the force of a back-alley ambush. It's why his fight scenes looked alive, not staged. He wasn't imitating rhythm. He embodied it. Off-screen, his reputation was equally paradoxical. He wasn't intimidating because of size or volume. He was dangerous precisely because he didn't posture. Bob Hope once quipped that Cagney was the kind of man who could flatten you in a bar, then dust you off and buy you a drink. That mix of menace and charm gave him a magnetism studios couldn't manufacture, and age didn't soften him. Where others grew brittle, Cagney's toughness refined into something calmer, more measured, but no less deadly. He knew when to strike, and he never wasted motion. Hollywood liked to sell the myth of toughness through costumes and dialogue. Cagney didn't need either. All he needed was a raised eyebrow, a sudden shift of his shoulders, and you could almost feel the punch before it landed. If toughness is about raw size, Cagney disproved it. If it's about loudness, he dismantled it. His brand of toughness was quieter, coiled like a spring, and far more unnerving. And if you think a dancer-turned-fighter was dangerous, wait until you hear about the man born during a revolution, who carried logs on his back at 46 and treated vulnerability as just another form of strength. Number 6. Anthony Quinn. If James Cagney embodied the wiry menace of New York's alleys, Quinn was the revolutionary spirit of Mexico carved into muscle and bone. He didn't just play strong men, he lived as one. Born during the chaos of the Mexican Revolution in 1915, Quinn's earliest lullabies were not songs, but the sounds of rifles cracking in the distance. By the time his family fled across the border to East, Los Angeles survival was no longer abstract. It was a daily calculation. In the slums of LA, weakness wasn't an option. By 9 years old, Quinn was already grinding through brutal jobs, hauling meat as a butcher's assistant, swinging hammers at construction sites, laboring wherever his small hands could find a grip. Childhood games. Those were for other kids. For Quinn, every dollar meant food, and every day meant another chance to prove he could endure. When desperation grew sharper, he found another outlet: boxing. Real punch, real bruise, real stakes. His famously crooked nose wasn't a studio effect. It was the legacy of hard rounds in smoky gyms. Those fights taught him resilience, but also a rhythm of survival that carried into every role he ever played. By the time Hollywood came calling, he had already built a reputation as someone who could take punishment and keep moving. What separated Quinn from other tough guys, however, was his refusal to hide behind macho posturing. He could be ferocious, but he could also break down in tears on screen without losing an ounce of credibility. During Zorba the Greek, he famously carried massive logs across a beach, lumber so heavy it usually required 2 men, yet in the same breath he could sway into a dance, grinning with contagious joy. That duality, strength, and vulnerability wasn't just acting, it was Quinn's life philosophy. On The Guns of Navarone, producers panicked when he volunteered to climb a dangerous cliff himself at the age of 46. Insurance officials begged him to use a stuntman. He dismissed them with a wave, strapped in and scaled the rock face anyway. For him, physical risk wasn't bravado, it was obligation. If the role demanded it, he would deliver body and soul. Directors loved him for it. Co-stars felt it immediately. Audiences sensed it in every performance. Anthony Quinn was the rare figure who could embody a revolutionary leader, a hardened warrior, or a broken lover, and each felt real. His toughness wasn't confined to fists or muscle. It was emotional, spiritual, a survival instinct honed in both poverty and art. Hollywood adored to package strength as invincible bravado. Quinn shattered that illusion. He showed that true strength could also be tender, that resilience could include the courage to cry. And that's what made him terrifying. He didn't need to posture to prove his power. If a man who fled revolution and shouldered logs with ease still found room to weep, imagine the ferocity of the immigrant son who wrestled his way out of poverty, fought wars on the ocean, and refused to let even a helicopter crash or a stroke keep him down. Number 5. Kirk Douglas. If Anthony Quinn carried the weight of revolution on his shoulders, Douglas carried the burden of poverty and the relentless willpower of an immigrant's son. He wasn't handed anything in life. He wrestled for every scrap, every inch, every moment of recognition. And even when the world tried to break him through war, through injury, through disaster, he refused. Born Asur Danielovich to poor Jewish immigrants in New York, Douglas grew up in a house where food was never guaranteed. Hunger wasn't a metaphor, it was the constant growl in his stomach. To help his family, he sold snacks to mill workers, delivered newspapers, and even scrounged for coal dropped along the railroad tracks. Yet instead of breaking him, deprivation built something unshakable. He clawed his way into college with a wrestling scholarship, not for show, but for survival. Collegiate wrestling in those days was pure brutality, strength, pain, tolerance, and grit. Douglas excelled because he had no other choice. When World War II erupted, he enlisted in the Navy, serving aboard submarine chasers that prowled the Atlantic. These were small, vulnerable vessels, easy prey for German U-boats. In 1944, he was injured in service and medically discharged. Many men would have carried that wound like a lifelong excuse. Douglas wore it like another scar in his growing collection, proof that survival was his only real credential. On screen, he attacked every role with the same ferocity he once used to wrestle and fight. In Spartacus, he didn't just act the part of a gladiator, he trained with real fighters, absorbed real blows, and refused the safety of stunt doubles. He wanted audiences to feel the truth of combat, even if it left him battered. When a dangerous fall on set left him seriously injured, he returned to work within 48 hours. Pain was an inconvenience, not an obstacle. But Douglas's toughness didn't fade with age, it deepened. In his 70s, he survived a helicopter crash that killed 2 others. Most men at that age would never walk again. Douglas fought his way back onto his feet as if defying death was simply part of his schedule. Then, years later, he suffered a devastating stroke that stole his speech. Doctors doubted he'd ever communicate clearly again. Douglas, relentless as always, endured grueling therapy, clawed back his words, and even wrote a memoir about the experience. Director Stanley Kubrick once said of him, "When Kirk decided something was going to happen, it happened." That wasn't hyperbole. That was fact. His life was a string of impossible comebacks stitched together by sheer willpower. Hollywood adored to cast him as men who wouldn't bend. The truth, he never learned how. Whether facing hunger, torpedoes, broken bones, or even a failing body, Douglas kept rising. His toughness wasn't about being unbreakable, it was about breaking, and then forcing himself back together over and over. And if you think surviving a helicopter crash and a stroke sounds like the definition of toughness, wait until you hear about the Marine, who dragged a bullet-riddled body through life and carried real battlefield scars onto the Hollywood set. Number 4, Lee Marvin. If Kirk Douglas embodied resilience, Marvin embodied something darker, authentic danger. He wasn't acting when he moved like a predator, or when his eyes carried that hollow calm. He had already lived through the kind of violence most people only read about in history books. Marvin served in the Marine Corps during World War II, fighting in some of the Pacific's bloodiest campaigns. At the Battle of Saipan, he took machine gun fire straight through his back. The bullets shredded his sciatic nerve, leaving him with a limp that he disguised for decades on screen. To most directors, that limp looked like a choice, a stylistic flourish. In truth, it was the echo of war carved into his bones. While other actors studied how to portray killers, Marvin didn't need lessons. He had seen death, felt it in the heat of combat, and carried it quietly ever after. What unsettled audiences about Marvin wasn't his aggression, but his stillness. He didn't lunge across the screen with wild theatrics. He moved with the economical precision of someone who knew real violence isn't flashy. It's quick, efficient, and final. Directors noticed. His co-stars felt it. Watching Marvin act was like standing too close to a man you knew had killed and could do it again if pressed. The stories followed him off set, too. During location, shooting in Oregon, Marvin ended up in a bar fight with multiple lumberjacks. Witnesses swore he held his own against several men, then turned up the next morning to film, bruised but unfazed. He treated bruises the way most men treated a shave, just part of the morning routine. But what made him so unnerving wasn't brawls or scars. It was his refusal to overstate them. He didn't brag, didn't inflate his legend. He let silence do the work. His power came from that quiet confidence, the terrifying certainty of a man who had nothing to prove. You could see it in his eyes. The war never left him, and he never pretended otherwise. On screen, when he played soldiers, hitmen, or criminals, audiences weren't watching an act. They were watching memory. Marvin brought the battlefield to the backlot, the ghosts of Saipan trailing him into every role. Hollywood didn't just hire an actor. They hired a man who carried war under his skin. And that's the paradox. Marvin never shouted his toughness, never strutted. He simply existed, and in that existence, people felt danger. Some actors looked dangerous. Marvin was dangerous. If you think that kind of quiet menace is chilling, just wait until you meet Hollywood's king of cool, a Marine who saved 5 lives, defied every studio order, and chased danger like it was oxygen. Number 3, Steve McQueen. If Lee Marvin carried the silence of the battlefield, McQueen carried the roar of rebellion. Hollywood called him the king of cool, but cool barely scratched the surface. Beneath the sunglasses and motorcycles was a man who seemed allergic to safety, someone who risked everything, not because he had to, but because danger was the only thing that made him feel alive. McQueen's childhood was a blueprint for survival. Abandoned by both parents, shuffled through abusive households, he ran away at 14 and drifted through reform schools where violence was currency. Trouble followed him, and he followed trouble back. Yet when he finally landed in the Marines, something shifted. He didn't stop rebelling, he was demoted 7 times and spent over 40 days in the brig. But when real danger struck, he revealed his true character. During Arctic training, a tank broke through ice and began to sink. McQueen dove in and rescued 5 trapped Marines, risking his own life without hesitation. That paradox-defiant troublemaker and steadfast hero would define him forever. Hollywood never tamed him. Insurance companies begged him to stop performing his own stunts. He ignored them. On The Great Escape, he performed almost every motorcycle stunt himself, and when producers refused to let him attempt the infamous fence jump, he sulked like a caged predator. On the sand pebbles, he nearly drowned, filming river scenes, clawing his way back to the surface, and then insisting on another take. For the towering inferno, he marched through blazing sets, insisting on real fire licking at his skin. It wasn't just work. Off-screen, he raced motorcycles and cars professionally under fake names, hiding his entries from studios, terrified of losing their most bankable star. At the brutal 1,970 Sebring race, he placed second overall while wearing a cast on his foot. Who does that? Someone addicted not to fame but to adrenaline. His recklessness wasn't always cinematic. When Charles Manson's kill list surfaced, McQueen's name appeared on it. Did he retreat, hire bodyguards, live in fear number? He simply started carrying a loaded Magnum revolver wherever he went. That wasn't posturing, it was the logic of a man who never trusted safety to anyone else. Stuntmen who worked with him often joked they had no job when McQueen was on set because he refused doubles. One of them once said, "Steve didn't act like a racer or a fighter, he was better than most professionals I knew." And that's the truth. McQueen wasn't pretending to be fearless. He genuinely was. His life wasn't about imitating danger. It was about consuming it, chasing it, needing it the way others need air. But for all his recklessness, there was discipline in his madness. He knew when to channel that wild edge into a character, giving audiences not a performance but a glimpse of raw appetite for risk. He wasn't Hollywood's safest star. He was Hollywood's daredevil, a man who could make standing still look dangerous, because you knew he might explode into motion at any second. And if McQueen felt like the edge of a knife, then number 2 will feel like a hammer, an actor who refused stunt doubles, filmed through torn ligaments and cancer treatments, and believed endurance was the only true measure of strength. Number 2, Charlton Heston. If Steve McQueen was Hollywood's daredevil, Heston was Hollywood's iron wall. He didn't chase danger for thrills, he endured it because he believed that was his duty. For Heston, strength wasn't just a performance, it was a code of honor. Before he ever hoisted stone tablets as Moses or drove chariots as Ben-Hur, Heston served as a radio operator and aerial gunner in the Army Air Forces during World War II. He wasn't on the glamorous front lines, but he lived inside the daily grind of military discipline, watching planes fall, knowing each flight might be his last. That experience stamped him with a resilience that outlived the war and bled into every role he ever played. Hollywood loved his towering frame, his stern jaw, his commanding voice. But what separated Heston from other actors was his refusal to ask for mercy. When Cecil B. DeMille handed him heavy stone props for the 10 Commandments, Heston didn't complain that they were exhausting. He lifted them, take after take, his shoulders, aching his back, screaming until the director had what he wanted. On The Greatest Story Ever Told, he tore shoulder ligaments performing a stunt. Did he halt production number? He wrapped the injury during lunch and was back on set that same afternoon, grimacing through the pain but never breaking the scene. The most haunting proof of his endurance came with The Conqueror. Like John, Wayne Heston worked near the Utah nuclear test sites, inhaling radioactive dust that would later claim the lives of many cast and crew. He eventually lost a lung to cancer. For most actors, that would have ended everything. But Heston refused to step aside. Even after surgery, he kept performing grueling, physically demanding roles, sometimes gasping between takes, yet always showing up when the cameras rolled. And here's the twist. Heston's toughness wasn't ego. He didn't endure to look impressive. He endured because he believed the show had to go on. He treated pain as irrelevant illness, as an inconvenience, and personal comfort as a luxury he couldn't afford. Directors marveled at him. Co-stars were awed. Audiences had no idea that behind the scenes, the man who looked immortal was pushing himself through agony most people would never tolerate. What makes his toughness so chilling is the cost. Hollywood adored him for playing prophets and warriors, but the industry that celebrated his strength was also complicit in grinding him down. He embodied endurance until endurance consumed him. Heston proved that toughness isn't about invincibility. It's about suffering quietly, relentlessly, until the role or life itself demands more than you should have left to give. If you think that sounds tragic, wait until you meet number one, the boy soldier, who looked too gentle to be lethal, who killed more enemies than entire combat units, and whose quiet stare carried both heroism and unbearable nightmares. Number one, Audie Murphy. If Charlton Heston represented endurance, Murphy represented the raw, terrifying truth of what toughness actually costs. He wasn't a Hollywood creation at all. He was a battlefield legend who carried war into every room he entered. At just 19 years old, Murphy performed an act so impossible that even Hollywood later downplayed it because audiences wouldn't believe it. In January 1945, the frozen woods of France, he single-handedly held off an entire German company. Ammunition running out, he climbed onto a burning tank destroyer, used its machine gun until it jammed, and then called artillery fire dangerously close to his own position. Wounded, nearly consumed by fire, he refused to leave until reinforcements arrived. That action earned him the Medal of Honor. By his 21st birthday, Murphy had received every American Medal for Valor, available 28 decorations in total. Military historians estimate he personally killed over 240 enemy soldiers, numbers so high they sound like myth except they were recorded fact. And here lies the haunting paradox. Murphy looked like a boy. At enlistment, he was barely 5'5", weighing only 112 pounds. Studio guards laughed when he first walked onto the lot, assuming this gentle-looking kid couldn't possibly be the most decorated soldier in American history. That contradiction, innocent face, lethal capacity, made him mesmerizing on screen. When he starred in To Hell and Back, the film based on his own wartime experiences, producers actually toned down his achievements because the reality felt too unbelievable for audiences to accept. But Murphy's war never truly ended. Behind his calm demeanor lurked scars no camera could show. He battled severe PTSD long before the term even existed. He slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow, plagued by violent flashbacks. His wife recalled moments when he woke in terror unrecognizable, a man lost to memory and trauma. Colleagues spoke of his sudden shifts, the way his eyes could harden in an instant, as if the battlefield had never released him. Once, during a business argument, a man grew aggressive. Witnesses said Murphy's transformation was instantaneous, chilling. The man backed down immediately, realizing this wasn't an actor's glare, it was the gaze of someone who could kill without hesitation. Murphy himself never glorified his past. He didn't want to play war heroes. He preferred light roles, romantic comedies, westerns parts that let him escape the shadows of his service. But Hollywood predictably kept casting him as the soldier unable to resist exploiting the legend. Audiences loved the authenticity, but the truth was devastating. Murphy wasn't acting tough. He was reliving battles he could never escape. That's what makes him the toughest of them all. Not the medals, not the kill counts, but the way he bore invisible wounds that never healed. He smiled for the camera-charmed fans, even became a songwriter. But every night the war came back, and he endured it alone. Audie Murphy proved that real toughness isn't glamorous. It isn't swagger or stunts. It's a 19-year-old kid standing alone on a burning tank facing impossible odds, and surviving only to spend the rest of his life haunted by what survival really meant. And so our countdown ends, not with Hollywood myth, but with a tragic truth. The toughest man in Hollywood history was the one who wished most of all to leave toughness behind. And there you have it, the 10 toughest actors in Hollywood history. Not the ones who only played cowboys, gangsters, or war heroes, but the ones who dragged their real scars into the spotlight. From Robert Mitchum's prison glare to Charles Bronson's coal-stained silence, from John Wayne's radiation-poisoned endurance to James Cagney's explosive precision, each story shattered the line between acting and surviving. Anthony Quinn showed us that toughness could be vulnerable, while Kirk Douglas proved that resilience meant rising after crashes, strokes, and poverty itself. Lee Marvin carried battlefield ghosts into every role, and Steve McQueen raced headlong into danger as if life wasn't worth living otherwise. Charlton Heston endured through torn muscles and cancer, believing duty was greater than comfort. And at the top, Audie Murphy, the boy soldier who embodied heroism on screen while fighting nightmares off it. What do these men remind us? That Hollywood's golden glow often masked shadows darker than the scripts ever revealed. The industry sold legends, but the toughness you saw was forged in coal mines, foxholes, prison yards, and hospital beds. They weren't pretending. They weren't posturing. They were simply carrying the weight of lives that demanded grit from the moment they began. So now the question is yours. Which of these legends shocked you most? Whose story made you look twice at the face behind the poster? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. And if you thought today's celebrities were tough, remember what toughness once looked like when men who had already survived Depression-era streets and World War trenches stepped onto Hollywood sound stages. Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from cinema's shadowed past. Because in our next story, we'll peel back another layer of Hollywood's glitter to reveal the secrets it hoped you'd never discover.